All right, today we're going to dive into some of the core ideas from Silky Shah's book, Unbuild Walls. Now, this book presents a really powerful analysis of the U.S. immigration system. And for many people, it's a deeply challenging one. Our goal here is to simply walk through the main pillars of her argument piece by piece so we can really understand how she builds her case. So, the book doesn't start with policy or politics. It starts with a person, a man named Jesse Jerome Dean Jr. He had done his time, over 20 years, for a drug trafficking charge, and he was finally set to go home. But he didn't. He died from COVID-19, not in a regular federal prison, but in an immigrant prison, on the very day he was supposed to be a free man. And that right there, that's the central question that really drives the whole investigation in the book. I mean, on the surface, it just doesn't make any sense. It feels like a bureaucratic nightmare, a terrible mistake. How did these two separate systems, the criminal justice system and the immigration system, get so tangled up that something like this could even happen? Well, the book's argument is that this wasn't a fluke. It's the tragic but logical result of a system built intentionally over decades.
So, to understand how we got to this point, the book first looks at the system's foundation, its legal architecture. The argument is that a whole series of laws, passed with support from both parties, systematically laid the tracks for the detention and deportation machine that exists today.
You know, what's really wild when you look at this timeline is just how fast this all happened. In just one decade, from the mid-'80s to the mid-'90s, you see this chain reaction. The '86 IRK is famous for amnesty, right? But the book points out it also seriously ramped up enforcement. That same year, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act forged a direct link between drug crimes and getting deported. Then in '88, this new legal category gets invented that changes everything. And by 1996, a law called IIRIRA just blew the doors wide open, massively expanding what counted as a deportable offense and even applying it backwards in time, retroactively. Okay, so let's zoom in on this term. Because according to the book, this was the real engine of the whole thing, aggravated felony. It started out pretty small, covering just the most serious crimes like murder and trafficking. But over the next 10 years, Congress just kept adding more and more offenses to that list. And here's the kicker. If an immigrant got convicted of one of these, detention and deportation became mandatory. It stripped judges of their discretion, creating this automatic pipeline that just swept people up. No questions asked about their life, their family, or their story. So when you put all those pieces together, the book's conclusion is that the system literally started to manufacture a category of people, criminal aliens, by design. By constantly stretching the definition of what crimes could get an immigrant deported, these laws created an ever-growing pool of people who could be funneled from one system, criminal justice, straight into another, the detention and deportation machine. And this, the book argues, is how a man like Jesse Jerome Dean Jr., who had served his time, ends up in an immigration prison, where he would ultimately die. But illegal fair work is one thing. What really fueled its explosive growth, according to the book, was money. And that brings us to the second part of the analysis, which is all about following the money to understand the business of immigration enforcement. The scale of this is just, well, it's staggering. The book points to this number, $55 billion in government contracts since the 90s. I mean, to put that in perspective, that is way more than the yearly budget for a lot of U.S. states. This isn't some small side project. The author argues it's a massive industry, something one journalist called the border industrial complex. And the author lays out this whole ecosystem of different players who have a financial or political stake in keeping the system going. I mean, you got the obvious ones, like the huge private prison companies that get paid per person they detain. But it goes so much deeper. The analysis points to local county sheriffs who make a ton of money renting out jail beds to ICE. It includes tech contractors selling the latest and greatest surveillance gear. And the book argues it even includes businesses that benefit from having a workforce that's kept in fear by the constant threat of enforcement. Now, this is where you can see how the financial incentive gets literally baked into the system. A lot of these detention centers have contracts with what are called guaranteed minimums. Okay, so think of it like this. It's like a hotel owner getting paid for 1,000 rooms every single night, even if only 800 of them are full. The government has to pay for a minimum number of beds, period, whether they're used or not. So what does that do? It creates this powerful, constant incentive to keep those beds full. It basically acts like a local quota system for locking people up. And this quote, wow, it's from the CEO of a corrections company, speaking to investors right after 9/11. It's a really stark look into the industry's mindset. The author includes it to show how moments of national crisis that lead to calls for tightening the borders are seen not as tragedies, but as business opportunities. It's a perspective where human lives and suffering can get translated into a positive on a corporate balance sheet. Okay, so we've got the laws that created the machine and the money that fuels it. But the book argues that there's a third layer, one that's just as important to make the whole thing work: the story, the social and political narrative we tell ourselves. And this is where the analysis digs into this idea of sorting immigrants, of deciding who is good and who is bad. The argument here is that two really powerful and conflicting narratives are constantly at work, and they actually help prop up the whole system. On one side, you have the model minority myth. It's often applied to Asian Americans and paints this picture of quiet, submissive success. The author argues this is incredibly damaging, not only because it erases a long history of anti-Asian racism, but also because it's used as a tool to divide communities. Then, on the other side, you have the stereotype of the criminal alien, which is used to justify all kinds of harsh enforcement by framing certain immigrants as a fundamental threat to public safety. And the book uses this quote from President Obama to show just how mainstream this way of thinking, this sorting, has become. I mean, on the surface, felons not families sounds pretty reasonable, right? It even sounds compassionate. But the book's analysis is that this kind of language, no matter who's saying it, reinforces the basic idea that there are good immigrants we should help and bad immigrants who deserve whatever they get. It ends up validating the logic of the entire enforcement machine. So what's the real-world consequence of all this? Well, the book argues that this good immigrant versus bad immigrant framework creates a political trap. It's like a devil's bargain. Advocates for immigrants feel pressured to accept this deal. We'll give you some relief for the good ones, like the dreamers, but in exchange, you have to support tougher enforcement on the bad ones. It's a deal, the author argues, that ultimately just makes the very system they're fighting even stronger. So after laying out this whole three-part analysis, the laws, the money, the narrative, the book doesn't just leave us there in this pretty grim reality. It actually proposes a totally different path forward, a radical rethinking of what's even possible. And this brings us to the core thesis of the book, which is centered on this idea of abolition. Now, that word, abolition, can mean a lot of different things to different people, so the book is really specific about its definition. It's not framed as just an act of tearing something down. Instead, it's presented as a constructive theory for social change, one that has three moving parts. First, there's the critique. That's the deep analysis we've just been walking through, understanding how all these systems are connected. Second, there's the horizon. That's the vision, the dream of what a more just world could actually look like. And third, there's the practice, the real, on-the-ground work of organizing, protesting, and building alternatives to get us there. So how do you actually put that into practice? This strategy is what the author calls non-reformist reforms. The idea is to look at any proposed change and ask a really simple but powerful question. Does this reform ultimately make the current system bigger and more powerful, or does it start to chip away at its power and resources? So, for example, the book argues that a reform like adding more body cameras just expands surveillance and funnels more money into the system. A non-reformist step, on the other hand, would be to actively reduce the system's budget and redirect those billions of dollars into things that actually create safe communities, like housing, education, and healthcare. And this right here, this is that horizon piece of the abolitionist idea. The ultimate goal, as it's presented in the book, isn't just the absence of prisons and detention centers. It's not about a world of empty cages. It's about the presence of something better. It's about building up what the author calls life-affirming institutions, the things that give people real safety and allow them to thrive. The book closes on this incredibly powerful and personal reflection. The author visits the site of a former Japanese-American internment camp, and standing there, she draws this stark parallel. She asks us to imagine a future where today's immigration detention centers become like that camp, just remnants of a violent history, reminders of what we should never, ever do again. And so we'll leave you with the book's final and maybe its most profound challenge. It's definitely not a question with an easy answer, but it gets to the absolute heart of the analysis, and it's a question for all of us. What does it take for society to actually learn from its past so we can build a different future? How do we stop repeating history in new forms? That's the central question Silky Shah's Unbuild Walls leaves us all to consider.